Now, if you wish to follow the spiritual path, you must make up your mind very clearly which is the particular line that you want to follow. Of course, one can pass from one line to the other. According to the Sufis, of course, every human being who has become a little sensitive and is seeking for something beyond the ordinary experience of daily life is a traveler, and he's progressing from one place to another, from one station to another. And that which brings about makes one's progress is the ability to see something that one wasn't able to see before. So that's the next step. When you're in a certain station, as they call it, well, things appear to you the way they appear, and then all of a sudden something happens to you. It might be a cosmic initiation that has transformed you entirely, and now all of a sudden you have reached the second stage, and then you go on to the third stage, and so on. What are these different lines? Let's say the first path, I would say, is the path of mastery. Now, maybe your path is not mastery, maybe your path is illumination, or your path is freedom, or your path is service, or whatever it is, saintlyhood, or prophecy. But let's take each one of these paths in turn. Now, if it is mastery, it means that you have to learn how to apply mastery all the time. At every move in your life, you apply mastery. For example, one of the ways of doing it is to check yourself from doing what your body would like to do or your mind would like to do. For example, if you're hungry, you don't eat. You can eat, but just once in a while you just do not eat when you're hungry. Or then if you want to speak, you don't speak. Or, for example, you sit in a position and maybe your legs are very painful, but you just keep on sitting in that position. Mastery is something that develops one's will to an extraordinary extent, and I think perhaps the best example of it is Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree for 49 days and nights without sleeping, meditating for all that time now. And of course, we don't know what the circumstances were like. There were wild animals, there was a lot of there were storms, all kinds of things, and there were bugs eating into the flesh of Buddha. An ant nest had settled on the top of his head, and there he sat in the middle of it all. Just imagine the kind of willpower that it needs to be able to do that kind of thing. Well, I've seen this willpower amongst some of the ascetics I've visited in India. Just absolutely incredible. The power that these beings develop through mastery is just, people have no idea what a human being becomes when he develops mastery. No, it's the kind of, you have to have the kind of mastery that is capable of sitting there watching a point, say for example a nail in a wall, and sit there and watch that nail for 2 or 3 hours. The kind of thing that develops power. We need power in our lives in order to accomplish things. We need power. Most of us lack power because we lack we lack mastery. We make our lives easy. I'm thinking of that dervish who could see into the hearts and souls of every person. And I tried to investigate and find out what are the qualities that make it possible for a being to have such insight. And it was clear to me that these beings will always choose the difficult path, never the easy path. And most people get soft living in society. We live in houses instead of, for example, there's a rishi I met in India. He sits in the snow throughout the night, meditating in the freezing cold. Now, that kind of a person develops a tremendous power, whereas we sit in houses and we catch colds. And people develop, we get insurance companies in order to insure ourselves against the unknown, and telephone answering machines. We just, because we have made our lives easy for ourselves, or relatively easy, we lose the power that makes for intuition. You know that according to the tradition, Shiva always sat with a snake around his neck. Well, he's represented with a snake around his neck. Actually, he takes snake poison every day. He lets himself be bitten by the snake every day. He starts with little baby snakes and then gradually lets the bigger snakes bite him until he develops immunity against evil. That's what it is, really, against hardships. And that's the way you get strong. A typical mastery is the ability to face insults without being angry. Now, you think that anger is an expression of power? Not at all. It's a loss of power. There's all the difference between an explosion and an implosion. If you get angry because you've been insulted, well, then all your energy is lost. But that very energy that is brought about by being challenged can be directed into something positive. And that's implosion, where the energy is directed in a positive way. I think of Jesus being, exposed to incredible ignominy when he was captured by the Romans. Do you think that he was angry? Oh no, I see him holding his head high. I would even say that the tortures, he was probably subjected to tortures, gave him a sense of ecstasy. Oh yes, in the temple, yes. Then he manifested divine wrath, something like the thunder and the lightning, the power of the prophet in the desert. He carries a lot of fire in his being, but it was impersonal, you see. It wasn't because he was attacked in his person. That makes all the difference. Now, this is a good thing to remember because we are continually subjected to all kinds of tests, and if we just let ourselves explode into a temper, well, then we lose our energy. It doesn't mean that we have to cringe either. We can keep our head high, and I think that is what happens. The energy is transmuted from ordinary temper into what one could call a sense of dignity, or keeping your head high under incredible circumstances. I'm thinking of I think the most wonderful case that I know is the case of this Catholic priest who was celebrating Mass in a concentration camp in Germany, and they kept on, the Nazis would come and take him and beat him up, and then he would have to crawl back again. He was so badly tortured by the Nazis. And he would continue celebrating the Mass with perhaps more fervor than ever before. That's what I mean by power, you see. That's the divine power. It's not personal power, it's the divine power. Now, there are many techniques used in meditation in order to develop. I would say that meditation generally is discipline. It's discipline. One says spirit over matter, or let's say the conscious will over the unconscious, or the whatever it is mastery. Now, if you develop this kind of mastery, then you can control your thoughts by your will. If you don't develop this kind of mastery, there's no use trying to control your thoughts with your will. You won't be able to do it. Your thoughts are much too strong to be able to control them with your will. It's better then to use the method that we used yesterday, which consisted in watching your thoughts and realizing that they are the result of your ignorance, and as a consequence they don't have a hold upon you anymore, and you're free from them. But if you try to check them, then, well, you can do it only if you have the kind of willpower of a man who is able to sit, as I say, in the snow or put up with the most incredible hardships without blinking. Now, the danger, the drawback of the path of mastery is that it can become a terrible ego trip. If one experiences satisfaction in applying one's personal will, and that is a thing that you see a lot in India. You see a lot of people experiencing satisfaction, the fact that they're able to stand on one leg for 48 hours or something like that, or 2 weeks at a time sometimes. So the great secret of the path of mastery consists in becoming the instrument of a greater power. That's the reason why the Jalaluddin Rumi, who's a great Sufi, says, the man of God is a king in patch robes, he is a temple in a ruin. It describes that attitude of a being who is fragile in his personal being and is powerful because of the power that's working through him. Instead of the man who applies his power, which is limited, and is unable to become the instrument of a greater power. Now, I see that a lot when people repeat mantrams, for example. So there's a practice that is done by the Sufis, which I was going to do. I was hoping that we would share a little bit later. La ilaha illallah. It's a very powerful practice. And I see people doing it using their own power, like you feel a very strong ego doing the practice. It's very difficult to do it in a powerful way and be completely, how can I say, just a vehicle for a greater power. That's the secret of the words of Christ. Let thy will be done. Hazrat Inayat Khan says, let thy wish become my desire. In other words, may I myself wish what is thy wish. So it's a difficult path. You must be careful of the conflict that can arise by meeting your will against your thoughts. For example, your thoughts have every right to function, and if you you're checking them with your will, you create a conflict in yourself. Whereas if you're able to look upon your thoughts and realize what they're trying to do to you, then you have a hold on your thoughts, and you're not creating a conflict. And that's why, generally, I don't advise people to use their will against their thoughts, unless you develop that kind of will that I'm talking about, the divine will, and then everything is under control. Hazrat Inayat Khan, my father, once said, if you're riding a horse and the horse doesn't obey you, it's because your fingers do not obey your mind. And once you have yourself in hand, you have all situations in hand. And if you can't control yourselves, the situations themselves get the best of you, and everything breaks down. It means that you're not controlling yourself. So it's a great secret. In fact, man becomes the ruler of his destiny, and you can actually control and transform your nature completely, and your astrological, all the astrological influences in your life. So those of you who feel that that's your path, this is your path, well, then I advise you then to use mastery consciously all the time. All the time. You see, whatever desires we have, they are a kind of energy, like, the wish. An impulse is a form of energy. And we don't want to kill that energy. What we want to do is to harness that energy. So maybe it's not the right word to say that one should check an impulse. One should use that energy and direct it in a way that will give one power. I think that's the way to put it. Now, the path of asceticism, you find that a lot in India, of course. I've come across doctors, for example, who've given up their practice and gone into the solitude. And meditation has often been used by people as an escape from life. Now, it is true that when a person becomes very evolved, they become very, very sensitive. Like a deer in the forest that wants to run away from men, there comes a time in your life, and I think that many people go through this in their life. They go through a state which I think corresponds to the first phase in alchemy, in the ars regia of alchemists, which consists in the breakdown of the personality before it is replaced by a new personality. Because all progress always starts by a breakdown of the existing composition so that it is replaced by a new one. And at that moment, when you are breaking down, you become very sensitive. And a lot of people don't know how to cope with people or cope with life because the emotions of people, or thoughts of people, or the manners of people appear so hard or ruthless or vulgar or gross. And it's a sign of evolution when you become sensitive to the egos of people. And naturally, of course, the tendency that most people would have is to run away or protect themselves in some way. Generally, of course, people protect themselves against other people's egos by their ego. And when you become very fine, you can't use your ego anymore. And so your only protection is detachment. And that's the reason for the importance attached to that word used in the East called vairagya, which means detachment. Buddha says it very beautifully. He says, surround yourselves with a zone of silence. So that nothing can, nobody, no situation can grab a hold of you. You're free. Now that means really that you see, either you run away, you see, which is not a solution, or you surround yourselves, as I say, with a zone of silence, which means that if everything breaks down in your life, you are not broken. And if everything goes wonderfully and you've had a wonderful success, you're not particularly jubilant. That's what it means. It means that you have overcome your emotions. Now, it does not mean that you don't love. It means that you don't depend upon love for your joy. It's quite another. Detachment doesn't mean that one has to be cold towards other people. You can be absolutely overwhelming with love for all beings. But you are detached in the sense that you're not dependent upon their love for your happiness. And you're not dependent upon circumstances for your happiness. The freedom that a person experiences when he has been able to reach that stage is extraordinary. Just imagine that nothing can shatter you. Now, if you can develop this ability, wherever you go, people will feel the sovereignty of your being. It will be an inspiration for people to feel just how free a human being can become if he is able to overcome himself. Now, this is a matter of what one values in life. Like, if you value a thing and you lose that thing, of course, then you feel very bad about it. You're shaken by it. But as one evolves, one changes in the value that one attaches to things. You know how a little girl will perhaps can't sleep without having her doll, and then maybe after some years she gives up her doll and it's not important for her anymore. And so we are all the time, we're changing all the time. Things that we used to value, we don't value anymore. And if that is so, then we are progressing. I would even say that our progress is in proportion to our renunciation of things which we used to value. For one person, $1 million is just a lot of money, and for another, it's not important. That's not important. There are people who pay pearls for their stones, and other people who pay stones for their pearls. Just depends upon what you value. There are some people who would rather live in a little hut somewhere and play the violin, for example, and another person will sacrifice his talent in order to live in a nice apartment. It just depends upon what you value. But one can say that you can assess the degree of evolution of a person by what he values. Hazrat Inayat Khan once says you can assess the degree of evolution of a person by what makes him laugh and what makes him cry. You can see just what a person is like. Now, the ascetic reaches, or the person who has an ascetic nature reaches a point when he changes somehow his estimation of things. Like, for example, he can't stand luxurious things. He wants things to be very ascetic, very plain. He would rather live in a cave with stones and just pure water and ice and go into the desert or some place where everything is very pure. It's like asceticism develops in a person who has a great need for purity and who feels that one is continually compromising in life in order to be able to maintain oneself in life, and he can't do that anymore. He has a tremendous sense of authenticity, and so he'd rather withdraw from it all because it's like sham. Everything's sham to him. People are just pursuing phantoms, and he sees it all, and he can't bear with that, you see. Now, asceticism would lead to this place which I've often referred to, and which some of you, if you feel in harmony with what I'm saying, then this is the practice for you to do. And that is to get into that, meditate, get into that place where the source of life flows out of a landscape of ice and snow. It's a landscape of the soul that is described in these terms. It's something like a very cold, very frigid place beyond life. And all that you experience is this flow of life trickling out of its source, a very pure. Let's say we say in Sufism, we say the life of life is like the quintessence of life. It's a pilgrimage to the source of life. So this is a subject of meditation for those of you who have a tendency towards asceticism. Now, asceticism will lead people towards liberation from all of this, as they call it, all of this down here. That's the way of Buddhism, for example. There's a thought that there's a feeling that we have all been caught up in this kind of a hoax, and it is our desires which keep us in subjection. We are conditioned by circumstances. We're not free, and at a certain moment you feel, well, I don't want to keep playing this game anymore. I've seen through it, and I want to be free. And as a consequence, you feel like giving up all those things that you attached importance to, and all you want to do is to get into that state of peace, or let's say, to use Hindu Sufi symbology, to return to the state in which you were before you became. It's like a return to the origin. And that's Buddhism. It's a return to the origin. One could say it is disincarnation instead of incarnation. I would say that if you're following the path of asceticism, and if you follow it till the bitter end, you will reach a point when you will reverse the whole process, like you become so free now from everything that you are able to renounce renunciation. Dare you renounce renunciation out of love? I would say that to seek for liberation for oneself is the highest of egotism. First of all, behind it all there is a devaluation of what is achieved in life. And I know that one can argue the fact that whatever is achieved in life is transient, and therefore it has no value, and so on and so forth. So you can't take it with you. We've heard these arguments before. That would be so if it were not true to say that that which we have become in our personality, that means that which has been achieved as a reality in our being down here on the physical plane, is, let's say, undergoes a kind of a process of transmutation, so that the essence of the essence of our being is carried back into the seed, into our eternal being. What I mean to say is that what has been achieved on earth is not lost. It is transmuted. And that being so, then life on earth is important. And therefore, to seek to free oneself from life on earth seems to go counter to the meaning of life. I understand that one may be, by temperament, one may need freedom, one may need to follow the path of asceticism, but as I say, that may be because you're undergoing a certain transformation. But having undergone this transformation, then you go right back into life again. But this time, everything has changed because you've become grown up. You've grown up, and you're able to play with the children of the earth, play their game, and enjoy their game, and not try to think that you're any better than them. But you've gone through it all. And you understand that people attach the importance that they do to things because they haven't yet gone through all the things that you've gone through. And that makes you very strong. Whereas the ascetic at first is very fragile in the sense that he can't stand all the tests of ordinary life. And then he becomes so free in himself that he becomes strong as a lion and is able to face all circumstances. And that, of course, is a wonderful achievement. Path of freedom is very close, of course, to the path of asceticism. It really means that you want to be free from conditioning. You know that there is a philosopher who or let's say a guru, a teacher, he doesn't want to be recognized as a guru actually. It is Krishnamurti who teaches freedom, the path of freedom. And that might be your path, the path of freedom. Now that means that you have to be free from anything that is motivating you, let us say, that is conditioning you. And once you follow this path, you realize that what people are doing is, well, people are just like puppets. That one is just conditioned, for example, by society, by one's environment. People do things because that's the way it's done, and everyone's thinking it's been conditioned. You're not free. You think the way people think, and how far is it original? Is it your thoughts? Not at all. It's just the way people think. It's the way the mind is made and mind is developed. Yesterday I was talking about, assuming that you are what you think you are. There's a wonderful sentence of a Sufi poet who says, "Glory to sleep, because the kings forget that they're kings, and prisoners think that they're free, and patients think that they're well." Why do kings think that they're kings? Because people treat them as though they were a king, so they assume that they're a king. But if people didn't treat them like a king, they wouldn't begin to wonder whether they're a king or not. Just imagine that young man whose father has placed a fortune in his bank, in his account, and he doesn't know it. And he goes around saying, "I'm poor, I don't have any money." And he doesn't know that his father, that he is actually rich, but he doesn't know it. And we think that we know who we are. And in fact, it's just a picture that has developed in time, a mask. We're not free. If there's another saying that says, oh, prisoners, if only you knew that you were free, and if you're not free, it's just because you don't know that you're free. We don't know that we're free. And the path of freedom is to realize that you're free. I'll give you an example. For example, you belong to a movement that makes you believe in certain things, and you're kind of questioning those things in your mind, and yet you feel somehow there's the pressure of that movement that you have to believe in the things that movement has taught you. And then somebody says to you, do you really have to believe? Why do you have to believe that? Yes, why do you have to believe it? I don't have to believe it, do I? Of course I don't have to believe it. And then you're free. All of a sudden you didn't realize that you were free. And all of a sudden you realize that you didn't have to believe in it at all. It's just because you thought you had to believe in it that you thought you had to believe in it. You're free. That's a path of freedom. So the person who is free wants to be free from, for example, you might do something because your body wants to do it. You're not free. To be free is not to allow yourself to be bullied by your body. And the same thing applies to the mind. Not to allow a thought to become obsessive and force you to think about it. You have to be able to be free from any form of conditioning whatsoever. And the same is true of emotion. Do not allow any emotion to condition you, and then you're free. Now, I'm sure that some of you have experienced moments of freedom. Like, for example, even freedom from a relationship. Maybe a relationship was weighing upon you, and it was broken. Something happened and that relationship was broken. And despite the sorrow that you have for the break in the relationship, all of a sudden you feel free. It's a wonderful feeling. One of the greatest forms of freedom is when one realizes that, let's say, what seemed to be a gain was a loss, or what seemed to be a loss was a gain. For example, has it ever occurred to you just how lucky it is that things didn't happen the way you wanted them to happen 10 years ago, for example? Or what a pity it is that things did happen the way you wanted them at that time to happen? Now you're able to see things differently. Then you wanted things to happen the way you wanted them at that time. In other words, now you're free from the way you felt then. That's freedom, you see. And because you're free, you're able to see things more clearly. And when you're not free, you can't see things clearly. Now this is something that you can do in meditation. You can, if you feel that that's your path, the path of freedom, you can follow the path of freedom in meditation. And one of the ways of doing it is when you sit in meditation, you free yourself from the gravity pull of the earth plane. Like, for example, if you listen to a sound in the street, and normally the attention is drawn to something outside, and meditation means that you do not allow that gravity pull to act upon your consciousness, and then you're free from it. Now, of course, it is the emotion of attachment or dependence upon the impression from outside which binds you. And of course, this is the essence of Buddhism. have to if you want to be free, you have to free yourself from that the link which binds you to the circumstances outside. In other words, as I say, you reach a point when whether everything breaks down or whether you are carried in a state of triumph, it doesn't make any difference to you. And that's freedom. I'll give you an example. For example, when Buddha was passing through the town, the city of which his father was the king, his father sent a procession to meet him, and they couldn't find him. And finally, they found that there were a few beggars begging in the back streets of the town, in the slums, and Buddha was one of them. He wasn't going to accept to be honored as they had sent a big procession to meet him. He was free. You are free when nothing can hold you, nothing can bind you, nothing can influence you. And this is a form of meditation which you can develop. All you have to do is, as you meditate, to experience that freedom in yourself. It'll make you very, very peaceful. We were talking about relaxation yesterday, like a condition of meditation to be able to relax. Well, that's it. You can't relax if you want this and you want that, or you want the other thing, and you're worried about this or you're worried about that. I think perhaps one of the secrets of relaxation is the thought that nothing can go wrong. It can only go wrong from your point of view. But ultimately, everything is so well programmed that things don't ever go wrong in the great plan. But they might not fit into your plan. That's true. And then you're free, you see. I remember I met a yogi who has lived in the forest for about 10 years. And he said that he was sitting in the forest one day, and he had this beggar's bowl next to him, and when he got out of his meditation, he couldn't see his beggar's bowl anymore, and he started looking around, wondering where on earth he'd left his beggar's bowl. And it took him a few hours to go back to the place where they had bathed in the water and so on. And finally, it occurred to him, well, I suppose perhaps a monkey must have taken my beggar's bowl. And then he thought to himself, now imagine I've lost all of this time worrying about the one and only possession I had, which was my beggar's bowl. And he was giving us a talk, and he said, I can't see how you can meditate with all your possessions. And I just had that one possession, and look at all the time that I lost in meditation, from meditation looking for it. How can you meditate with all your possessions? Well, the thing to do is to have the possessions but not be possessed by them. In other words, if they're there, all right, and if they're lost, that's all right too. And then you're free. But if you worry about them, you're not free. Now, there's the way of service. And you'll find that there are people who just have to do something for other people in their life. Otherwise, their life doesn't make sense. We would all, I think most of us, would like to do something for other people. But the path of service is perhaps one of the most difficult paths of all. Because you don't help a person necessarily by carrying their load. On the other hand, you see that people are sometimes they're toppling over under the weight of the load, and so you have to help them in some way. Of course, most of us think that we can help people by advising them. We're all backseat counselors. We always think we know better how to run somebody's life than they themselves. One can do a tremendous harm to a person by advising them. Tremendous harm, and we're doing this all the time to each other. Be very careful. One word, if a person has some confidence in you and assumes that you know better than they do, one word of yours and they will act upon your word. And you're not only involving your own karma, but you're involving a whole chain of karmic situations that can have tremendous repercussions in the whole pattern of life. And as a matter of fact, you do not help a person by telling them what to do, because you're taking away their chance of taking a decision upon themselves. And that's what the situation is about. That's the reason why they're facing a problem, is because the programming is trying to place them before their responsibilities. A person evolves by the decisions that they take freely. That is what makes a person progress in life. If you take away their chance of taking a decision, then of course you're not helping them at all. On the other hand, if you see that, say for example, a person is hanging on the branch of a tree and is scared of dropping, and that person's feet are only 1 foot above the earth, you tell him, look, the earth is only just 1 foot below your feet. So, in other words, if you can see something that another person can't see, it is your duty to bring them to the point that they're able to see it themselves. It's no use telling them, but you have to bring them to the point that they're able to see it. That's the way of service. But how do you bring them to that point? There's only one way, and that is to lift their consciousness so that they're able to see from a higher angle that which you see. It's just like, at the top, from the top of the hill, you can see much better than when you're right down in the valley. So all you have to do is to inspire them to such an extent that they're able to see something that they weren't able to see before. Now we must remember that people will always begrudge your having helped them, because for one thing it makes them feel indebted to you. It might even make them feel dependent upon you, or you might even take advantage of that situation in order to make them dependent upon you. And therefore, it's very difficult to help a person. You'll find that in the life of relationship, there is always a competition of wills. There's a balance of wills. One person's will prevailing upon another person's will. One person has to give in so that the other person's will may prevail. Egos are continually pushing the other egos into the corner. And if you want to help a person, sometimes you will find that the person whom you help will be will tend to push you aside. It's a very strange law. It's a law of reaction. Like the person who is in need of help turns the tables on you and makes you feel that you need their help. We have to be very careful, if you're following the path of service, to know how to help a person without making that person feel dependent upon you, and without allowing that person to turn tables on you. The path of service means that you dedicate yourselves to the programming, let's say to the guidance. It means that you have to understand how the lives of people are being directed by a whole hierarchy of beings who form what we call the hierarchy of masters, saints and prophets, who form the spiritual government of the world. In other words, the progress of humanity is brought about by making people aware of that which they were not aware of. It's like launching into new horizons. For example, in the time in which we live now, for example, consciousness is now reaching into outer space. Consciousness of humanity is moving into new horizons, and one could say that there is a guidance behind the thinking of mankind. So if you follow the path of service, it means that you take upon yourself the responsibility of the progress of beings. That's the path of the Guru, is to be responsible for the progress of human beings. It means that you have to establish a connection with people of responsibility, where you have to answer to some extent for their being. You know that when Gandhi was shot, he held his hands like this, looking at the person who shot him, saying, Ram, Ram, Ram. And really what he was saying is, please forgive me for not having convinced you of the truth of my teaching. He felt responsible for the act of violence that was caused against him, created against him. Now that's what I mean by the path of service. The one who is engaged in the path of service has to feel responsible for those whom he is trying to guide. You cannot just tell people, you cannot conduct people or direct people unless you make puppets out of people, and it's true that there are a lot of gurus who do that. And there are a lot of people who don't have enough will themselves and are glad for somebody to take over their will for them. And that is the best way of harming a person, by making that person into a kind of a subservient puppet. To help a person, you have to strengthen that person's pride. You have to strengthen that person's self-respect. In other words, you have to show respect for that person. And you have to be able to hand yourself into the hands of that person. Otherwise there's no connection. There's no real connection between you and another person unless you are able to hand yourself into the hands of that person. Hazrat Inayat Khan, my father, puts it in a very beautiful way. He says, the Guru is like a crystal, a very fine crystal, and he puts this crystal into the hands of his disciples, and he said, and the disciple takes that, grabs a hold of that glass and says, "If you don't do what I want, I'll break it." And that it that is going to be broken is your soul. You have handed yourself into the hands of people who don't know the value of what you have given to them. And you say, "Well, why do you have to do it?" Yes, if you don't do it, well, you can order people about, but you're not helping people. You can only help people if you establish that deep connection. Christ handed himself. You think that people crucified Christ? He handed his body to people to crucify. In fact, according to the esoteric tradition, God has crucified himself from the beginning of time so that people may be free. That's guidance. It's giving up your freedom in order to free people, instead of making people depend upon you. It's the other way around. You can be free inside, and you bind yourself by the people you want to help. And yet, you will never allow them to take away anything of your internal freedom. It's a very subtle thing. If you want to follow the path of service, you realize that it is the path of total sacrifice. And there is nothing that makes a person greater than when he has accepted the total sacrifice of his being out of love. Now there is the path of illumination. If that's the path that you want to follow, then this is the way to do it. The path of illumination means that you have to become absolutely radiant and luminous. It means that you have to eliminate or eradicate anything in your being that is dark, any darkness, like any feeling of despondency, like you feel that you've been badly treated by a person, or you've been badly treated by fate, or any feeling of a grudge that you might have against anybody. For example, you have to overcome those feelings in yourself. Like, for example, you say to yourself, if there's somebody you can't forgive, you have to forgive him in your soul. You have to forgive him. And you might not see that person anymore. You might not have seen that person for 20 years. And you imagine you write a letter to that person after 20 years and say, I've overcome all the ill feelings I had. You know, that person would be surprised to receive a letter after 20 years. Doesn't matter. Do it. And if that person has died, it doesn't matter. Your thoughts will reach that person. The important thing is that you overcome any darkness in your being. Now, of course, it means having the courage to look into the sun. It means having the courage to look at God in God's face. It means it starts by having the power to face yourself. It is the path of truth, of course. There are people in India, there are gurus who become so powerful that all you have to do is to come in their presence. And you see yourself somehow, you discover yourself just by being faced with their presence, because of the strength of their being. the light of their being shines in the darkness of your soul and will remove any darkness. Now that's the way of illumination. The illuminated being, the illuminated guru, if you want to follow the path of light, find a guru who is pure light. There aren't many who is pure light. And you will find that the light of his being penetrates into the dark chambers of your heart and illuminates you inside. It's just like having a bath of light. And the person who follows the path of illumination is continually bathing himself in light until he becomes just light, pure light. It's one of the most wonderful paths you could possibly follow. But it means being very strict with oneself, that one never allows any feeling of intolerance for a person, or grudge, or of course any hatred, of course, or any feeling of having been, any feeling, any personal feeling. It is being conscious of being a solar being. You know that our bodies are made out of the substance of the sun. Our bodies. The earth, the planet Earth, is made out of gases of the sun that have become cooled by having been expelled from the sun. So that our bodies are made of the substance of the sun. We are solar beings, and part of our soul is part of the sun, is part of the archangel of the sun. And if you realize yourself as being the heir to the archangel of the sun, this is to be found in the Zoroastrian teaching, you can meditate on your solar origin and make you absolutely luminous. Now, in more advanced stages of meditation, one becomes aware of oneself as a being of light, and in fact one begins to dream of beings of light. If you start dreaming of beings of light, it's a sign that you are earmarked to follow the path of illumination. And sometimes those dreams become more and more clear, and you suddenly find yourself in a sphere of beings of light. And you realize, of course, that there are beings of all kinds. There are all different types of spheres. And you belong to the sphere of light. Now, it might happen to you that when you experience that, you think to yourself, well, this is where I belong. I belong to the worlds of light. This is my real home. This is where I feel at home. And if that's the case, then that means that is the line for you. And follow the path of light. Now there's the path of realization. It's almost like a scientist who's able to see why things happen the way they do. That's a path of realization, and I think that many of you recognize that's the path you want to follow. It's like seeing the cause behind the cause behind the cause. Now, our minds are wonderful computers, but they only function within a certain realm. When it comes to vast orders of reality, let's say archetypal, transcendental forms of reality, our minds are unable to cope. And that is why the path of realization supposes the use of intuition instead of reason. And so we have to know how to apply intuition rather than reason. Now, I mentioned this yesterday, and there may be a few people here who weren't here yesterday. You have a hunch about something, and you don't follow the hunch, and the thing happens, and you think to yourself, what a pity. Now, if I had only followed my intuition. All right, another time you say, next time I'm going to follow my intuition. You have a hunch again, and you don't follow your intuition. And I think, what a pity. Now, I knew it, and I didn't do it. Next time I'll do it. And next time you follow what you think is your intuition, it was imagination. How can you tell the difference? Well, the difference is this, that if it's imagination, you are being active. And if it's intuition, you are being receptive. And so you have to know how to bring your mind into a receptive state, and if you want to develop intuition. You have to check any creative activity of imagination. You have to reverse the gear of your thinking, and reach a plane which I described yesterday as being above the dream state, which is called deep sleep without dreams, beyond dreams. And these are the practices that we're going to do after the break. I think we'll probably have to have a break, and then we'll do them after that. See how you can reach the state of deep sleep consciously. You see, you can, for example, you can daydream, which means that you are able to dream while being conscious of your dreams. And in the same way, you can be conscious of the state above dreams, which is what they call dreamless sleep. It is in that state that impressions descend on their way down to the place where they are being formed at the mind level. In other words, all thoughts may originate in two directions. Your thoughts may originate from experiences on the physical plane, and then your thoughts are commentaries, let's say, on what has happened, what you've experienced it through your senses. Or then your thoughts may descend from, one might say, from above, like that's what is called inspiration. Now, that means that they were pure, what can one say, pure, unmanifested, pure archetypes, and as they descend, they become concrete, and they pass through that blackout state, which is experienced during deep sleep, sleep without dreams. That's where the intuitions are formed. And then you have to be able to pass from the deep sleep state to the state of sleep with dreams in order to give expression to that intuition. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to experience it. It's got to be brought down into your thinking so that you are able to experience it concretely. All right.